This lecture is for my microorganisms and the human host course. And today's lecture is going to be a survey of fecal oral bacteria, and these primarily cause disorders of the digestive tract, digestive system. Now, depending on the strain of these, they could possibly result in bacteremia and even septicemia. Okay, the first one we're going to discuss today is an organism that causes shigellosis, and that is caused by Shigella dysentery. And there are a few other species of Shigella that can lead to this particular disorder. It can be Shigella flexneri, Shigella boydii, or Shigella sonii. Now, signs and symptoms. It can lead to dysentery, watery diarrhea, vomiting, convulsions, headache, and joint pain. Now, let me discuss dysentery for a minute. Dysentery is a type of diarrhea where either blood and or pus is coming out with the diarrhea. What happens is that the organism will destroy those cells, and it kind of comes out with that diarrhea. Now, pathogenesis, virulence of this particular organism, it invades those epithelial cells and the macrophages. It can hide within those macrophages, and sometimes the macrophage can't kill it, and it can actually divide in the macrophage. It can lead to a disorder known as HUS, and that stands for hemolytic uremic syndrome. Now, some strains will produce what's known as the Shiga toxin. We have talked about the Shiga toxin before, and the Shiga toxin will destroy those endothelial cells of the kidney. And it destroys red blood cells. So it's quite damaging to the body itself, and it will tend to shut those kidneys down. It can even cause nerve damage. Now, what is a treatment? It's usually a type of antibiotics. Usually antibiotics can treat this type of disorder. They say it is, it's pretty horrible to have shigellosis. It's highly contagious. One of the things that we do know about it, highly contagious. It has an infective dose of about 10 cells. So if you can imagine bacterial cells, this is a gram-negative rod, and 10 cells. 10 cells can cause an infection, can lead to an infection in a human. It is resistant to stomach acid. So, if you're eating something that's been contaminated, or even from close contact, and you touch your mouth, touch your nose, and it gets in, then you only have to have those 10 cells for it to establish an infection in the body. And if it's going to be resistant to stomach acid, it's going to get right on through to the small intestine and then therefore the large intestine. But luckily, antibiotics will treat shigellosis. The next one we're going to talk about is E. coli. So the full name for that is Escherichia coli, and it causes gastroenteritis. Now, other types of disorders you may have heard that E. coli causes, these are things like traveler's diarrhea. And by the way, E. coli is not the only one that causes traveler's diarrhea, but it's most known to cause traveler's diarrhea. It can cause urinary tract infections. It can cause HUS, just like what we talked about. Hemolytic uremic syndrome. It can lead to septicemia in the body and even meningitis sometimes. So signs and symptoms. Signs and symptoms, and it really depends on the strain. Now, here's the thing with E. coli. E. coli is a gram-negative rod, and E. coli is a normal inhabitant of the mammalian gut, of the mammalian large intestine. So we have a lot of E. coli. Mammals have a lot of E. coli in their large intestine. Now, when it's in our large intestine, it makes up part of our microbiome. And we've talked about our microbiome before, some advantages that we have, disadvantages of it. Now, this is a fecal oral, so if there's any fecal contamination whatsoever from a mammal, we can detect that, and how we do it is we look for what is called a coliform. A coliform is a gram-negative, rapidly fermenting organism, ferments lactose, and it it can be detected with certain tests. So right up here at the top, I have some little jars with color jars. And what this is an example of is a water test. So it's testing to see if that water supply, could be drinking, it could be swimming, um, could be a lake or a pond, any type of environmental water or drinking water, to see if it has been contaminated, fecally contaminated with mammal feces. And what we look for that coliform, and if a coliform is positive, we specifically go in and look for E. coli. If we do find E. coli, that is a lot of evidence for having mammalian fecal contamination. Okay, now why do we want to know that? Well, so it's kind of gross, first of all, but it's that this is a fecal oral disorder. So if E. coli causes fecal oral, if we ingest it, if it gets into our eyes, if it gets in our nose or mouth, it can cause digestive issues for us and other types of issues for us. So it really depends on the strain. There are lots of strains of E. coli. It can be anywhere from really non-virulent strains to highly virulent strains of E. coli. There are actually 4 different categories of E. coli that we can put the strains in depending on how virulent they are. So common signs and symptoms. You're going to have stomach cramps. You will have diarrhea with or without pus, and nausea. You could have fever. And these are pretty typical signs and symptoms of any type of fecal orally transmitted bacteria that can cause distress in the digestive tract. Now, like I said, for the pathogenesis and virulence, each strain actually has different virulence factors, and they are wide and varied in E. coli. But overall, it's going to affect the small and large intestine. One of the deadliest strains is in the group, one of those 4, that is called STEC, and that is Shiga toxin producing Escherichia coli. That's what the STEC stands for. So that means that E. coli has the ability to produce the Shiga toxin. And we had talked about how E. coli got the genes to code for that protein, and how we name these different strains, and we give them numbers. So an H and O for their antigens. So the one that produces the Shiga toxin, kind of the most deadly strain of E. coli, is O157H7. So you keep on the lookout for any type of report about E. coli, and always look for that O15H7. That tells us that's the most dangerous type of E. coli, or one of the most dangerous types of E. coli. Now, why do I have a picture of a hamburger up there? Why do I have a picture of a hamburger? What we do know is that in meat processing plants, if they're processing mammals, right? So let's say it's a beef processing plant, and they're processing mammals. And remember, I said E. coli is a normal inhabitant of mammal feces, and as it turns out, sometimes that gets into the meat, probably more often than we would like. Now, if we cook the meat thoroughly, it cooks the bacteria and we do not have a problem. If the meat is not cooked thoroughly, then what happens is that we have the potential to get sick from that. All right, so in looking at the different strains, we can that's a way that we can transmit the deadliest form of E. coli. Now, what is the treatment? It really depends on the strain. So some of the more deadly strains of E. coli, those individuals will get antibiotic treatment. Otherwise, they will have fluid and electrolyte replacement. The last one we're going to talk about today is Salmonella. So specifically Salmonella enterica, which causes gastroenteritis. Now, remember I just said about E. coli being the normal inhabitant colonizing the human gut, human large intestine? For poultry, for chicken, it was Salmonella, and one of the species is Salmonella enterica. Now, signs and symptoms. Signs and symptoms of an infection caused by Salmonella enterica. This can be diarrhea. Sometimes it's bloody diarrhea. It can cause nausea, vomiting, headache, fever, abdominal cramps, anything that you would normally associate with the digestive system, causing problems in the digestive system. Pathogenesis, what does it do? It affects the epithelial cells of the small and large intestine. That makes sense. This organism has the ability to multiply in the macrophage. So it hides away there in the macrophage and can multiply there. And it will cause an inflammatory response in the body. So that's pretty typical of those signs and symptoms. Now, for poultry, chicken and poultry, one of the reasons why we advise not to consume raw eggs is because it could be contaminated with an organism like Salmonella enterica, and it therefore cause an infection in the human. Same thing for handling raw chicken. This is just one of others types of pathogens that it could be contaminated with, and therefore transmit that to humans, right, in consumption of that particular meat. So we have to be extra careful that we cook chicken, cook all poultry, so that we have to reduce the risk of infecting ourselves with that particular organism. All right, guys, this is it. This is the last of our lectures. Time to study for your finals. I hope you enjoyed the class.